Math 3, Lesson Summary Video, Misleading Statistics. This lesson is a solidify understanding task, which takes concepts developed previously and helps formalize those ideas. The purpose of this lesson is to identify bias in sampling, questioning, and graphical representation, and be able to evaluate a statistical article or website with these skills. We will start by looking at different types of bias that occur in sampling. Sometimes you can be using a good sampling method, but bias still creeps in. Here are some common types. Undercoverage bias. Undercoverage occurs when some part of the population being sampled is somehow excluded. If voting for homecoming queen is done in the cafeteria during lunch, and most seniors leave campus for lunch, then the vote is biased based on undercoverage, since the off-campus lunch seniors were excluded from voting. Response bias. Response bias occurs when people being surveyed lie to the surveyor. This could be because they were intimidated by the surveyor or may fear consequences for their answers. What if a teacher surveyed her students by asking them in person about whether they cheated on their last test? This can often be avoided by making a survey anonymous. Non-response bias. This occurs when people choose not to respond at all. If you have ever hung up on someone calling with a phone survey, you have created an example of non-response bias. Voluntary response bias. This is when participants self-select to respond to the survey. An example would be a radio station conducting a call-in poll on whether Civil War monuments should be removed from public spaces. This creates voluntary response bias because the people who respond to these types of surveys tend to have strong opinions one way or the other. Determine whether or not bias exists in the sampling method. If so, identify the source of the bias. Then make suggestions on how this sampling method could be improved in order to select an unbiased sample. Scenario number 2. A newspaper is interested in determining whether working women support federal aid for childcare. A reporter attends a conference designed for women in professional careers and randomly selects 40 women attending the conference to complete the survey. This situation would have undercoverage bias. This situation would have undercoverage bias. The conference is working. This situation would have undercoverage bias. The conference is for working women, which is the population in question, but it is a conference for women in professional careers. This would not include mothers in service industries, food industries, small business owners, or other working options. The newspaper needs to find a way to get a better cross-section of working mothers in their survey. Scenario number 7. WRAL 101.5 announces during the morning show that they are interested in listeners' opinions on the new toll road between Holly Springs and I-40. Listeners are asked to call in and answer a few questions regarding the amount of tolls being charged on the road. This creates voluntary response bias. People who are mad about having to pay to ride on the road, or people who love that the road isn't crowded and they can get to work faster, are much more likely to respond than anyone else. Perhaps if they had a reporter standing at a gas station in Holly Springs asking every driver that stops at the station, they would get a more even representation of feelings. Wording bias occurs when the wording of the question itself influences how people answer it. There are 2 main types of wording bias we want to focus on. The first is loaded questions. These type of questions have extra information, attitude, inflection, or other emotions trying to influence a person's answer. This is often used when surveyors are looking to sway the results of a survey. Another type of wording bias would be leading questions. These are questions that give the desired answer in the question. You are actually leading the person to the answer you want them to give. This is also used when trying to sway the results of a survey. For each of the following survey questions, determine whether the question is potentially biased. If the question is potentially biased, rewrite it so that it is not. Question 1. Don't you agree that the voting age should be lowered to 16 because many 16-year-olds are responsible and informed? This is a leading question. The "don't you agree" statement is telling the person you want them to say yes. It would be better to just ask the question with no extra facts, as well as no lead into what you want them to say. Perhaps, do you believe the voting age should be lowered to 16? Question 4. Would you pay even higher concert ticket prices to finance a new arena? This is not an awful question, but it is a little loaded. By just adding the word even in front of higher, you are adding the emotion of frustration and having enough with all the high prices. You should always try to leave out any emotion words when writing questions for surveys. Perhaps a better question would be, would you pay more for concert tickets to fund a new arena? It is not just the selection of samples and collection of data that can be biased. Sometimes the data itself can be represented in such a way that the data is biased. Graphs can be misleading. Misleading graphs are sometimes deliberately misleading, and sometimes it's just a case of people not understanding the data behind the graph they create. The classic types of misleading graphs include cases where the vertical scale is too big or too small, the scale on either axis skips numbers or doesn't start at 0, the graph isn't labeled properly, data is left out, or pieces of a pie chart are not the correct sizes. For example, look at these graphs. Both graphs show exactly the same data, but the graph on the left makes the difference look much more dramatic because of the vertical scale that they used. Look at each graph carefully. Determine how each graph is misleading and what you could do to correct it. There are 2 graphs in this article, and both have parts that are misleading. The title of the section that includes the graphs is "The Times Leaves the Rest Behind, in Print and Online." The problem with the graph on the left is that it only shows the Times visitors to their website. It does not show any other newspaper, so you cannot compare if they are leaving anyone else behind. This would be an example of data that is left out. The graph on the right does include data from another news group, but the vertical axis on the right does not start at 0. This makes it look like the Daily Telegraph has made less than half the full price sales than the Times, when the data actually shows it is only a difference of 38,000, or about 8%.